The largest drop in the history of the stock market outside of 2020 during the pandemic crash just happened. The US government decided to tariff over 180 countries and territories, including a few uninhabited volcanic islands near Antarctica, covered in glaciers and only home to penguins, not humans. Yet, despite the tariffs on penguins and the stock market crashing, there's something much bigger at play here. Something going on in the background that will completely change the world and enter an era that we have not seen in generations. But to show you what's really going on today, I would like to show you a few comparable times in history where some things like widespread tariffs had domino effects that resulted in catastrophe. In the mid-17th century, England decided that it didn't have quite enough wealth flowing in, so it created the Navigation Acts, laws passed between 1651 and 1673, with their main premise being that only British ships, or colonial-owned ships, could carry goods to and from British territories. Essentially, they ended up tariffing every other country that they could. And even though these effects were temporarily good for the British, they were not good for, well, everyone else. You see, these acts significantly boosted British shipping and naval supremacy temporarily, transforming England into the globe's premier naval power. British merchants and shipbuilders rubbed their hands in glee, watching rivals such as the Dutch stumble in bewilderment and rage. By the late 1600s, England had decisively dethroned Amsterdam as the world's busiest trade hub, thus paving the way for the British Empire. But there was a catch. When you bully your trading partners, sooner or later someone decides enough is enough. The Dutch didn't appreciate having their lifeline choked and responded with guns and cannons, igniting a series of Anglo-Dutch wars. Eventually, Britain triumphed, but at a considerable cost. Imperial arrogance had created enemies, and smuggling became the international pastime of choice. Across the Atlantic, resentment simmered among the American colonists who felt the acts strangled their economic potential. British customs officials became about as popular as dental visits, and colonists grew increasingly creative at dodging taxes. Smuggling molasses was practically a sport at this point. Tensions escalated spectacularly, climaxing with colonists torching the British customs schooner Gaspee in 1772. The Navigations Acts had inadvertently laid the groundwork for the actual American Revolution, meaning that eventually Britain kind of taxed and tariffed itself right out of the world's most lucrative colonies. Ireland, always an afterthought to the English elite, fared even worse. British goods poured tariff-free into Ireland, obliterating local producers. Now, if there is one takeaway from Britain's mercantile arrogance, it's that squeezing your own colonies and partners to enrich a tiny elite does not end well. Now, a country that did not learn from this was Germany. In the late 1800s, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, a man who never saw a problem he couldn't complicate with political cunning, he introduced the so-called Iron and Rye tariffs, uniting German industrialists and agrarian elites, essentially a protectionist pact to shelter German industries and grain producers from foreign competition. Essentially, they were bringing back the jobs to Germany. At first, it worked. German landowners and factory barons rejoiced. Junkers, who were aristocratic landowners, kept profits rolling, shielded from cheap American wheat and Russian rye, while steel magnates fattened their wallets safe from British imports. Politicians declared victory, heralding a patriotic triumph of economic nationalism. But beneath this cozy arrangement lurked disaster. Higher food prices hit ordinary Germans hard, igniting class tensions and propelling the rise of the Social Democratic Party, who rightly accused the elites of feasting at the expense of the working poor. Social unrest grew, but Bismarck, ever the clever autocrat, responded by introducing early welfare reforms, hoping to placate the masses without upsetting his elite backers. But it only half worked. Internationally, Germany's tariffs sparked retaliatory trade wars all across Europe. Russia, formerly a friendly trade partner, was particularly upset when its grain exports were blocked, responding with its own tariffs on German goods. Relations soured, geopolitical alliances shifted ominously, and eventually Bismarck's careful balancing act collapsed as Germany's isolation pushed Russia into an alliance with France, setting the stage for World War I. I mean, did you know that grain tariffs could indirectly contribute to starting the worst world war humanity had ever seen at that time? Well, I bet the German people didn't know that either. And then lastly, we fast forward to the 1930s after World War I, and this was the dawn of the Great Depression, when America decided to dust off Britain's old tariff playbook with an impressive blend of ignorance and optimism. Enter Senator Reed Smoot and Representative Willis C. Hawley, whose names would forever become synonymous with economic catastrophe. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 was supposed to save American jobs by putting a wall around the US economy. It didn't. In fact, it did quite the opposite. Picture Smoot-Hawley as America deciding to crash the global economy's birthday party, flip the cake onto the floor, and then complain about the mess. Tariffs soared to all-time highs on over 20,000 goods, sparking global retaliation. Countries like Canada and the European nations imposed their own retaliatory tariffs, triggering a disastrous domino effect. By 1933, global trade shrank by an astonishing 65%, and US exports dropped by nearly 2/3. Farmers, the very people the tariffs aimed to protect, watched in despair as their exports vanished and incomes halved. Unemployment soared past 25%, breadlines formed, and banks collapsed by the thousands. Instead of creating jobs, the tariffs deepened the Great Depression, proving protectionism was economic self-harm. International trade imploded, economies seized, and suffering multiplied. By the time policymakers realized their mistake and reversed course, the damage was already done. Smoot-Hawley had effectively turned an economic downturn into a global catastrophe. You see, if history teaches us anything, is that tariffs, however appealing politically, rarely accomplish what they promise. You see, even though they have some use as a tool, as a weapon against potential enemies, in terms of being a long-term growth for your own economy, it typically doesn't work out over the course of decades. And each of these historical episodes revealed that protectionism serves powerful interests at the expense of the common people. British imperialists, American isolationists, German junkers, each acted to protect their privileges, blissfully ignoring the turmoil they unleashed. And that brings us to today. You see, today, modern policymakers view tariffs as quick fixes, no matter how many enemies they make or who they may hurt. As the recent American tariffs of April 22nd, 2025 have already sparked a spectacular stock market collapse, one wonders if we are doomed to yet again repeat these same economic catastrophes, but on a grander scale. You see, the US government under Trump's revival tour dropped a political bombshell, sweeping tariffs, a hefty 34% on Chinese imports and a cool 20% on everything European. A minimum 10% on pretty much every other country. Think of it like an economic fistfight, but instead of punches, they threw import duties. Wall Street initially blinked, chuckled nervously, and then did what it did best. Today, Wall Street panicked. You see, today, the stock market was a bloodbath. The Dow Jones Industrial Average nosedived nearly 1,500 points, losing 3.5%, erasing roughly $2 trillion of market value overnight. The S&P 500 dropped 4%, while the Nasdaq, home to the once untouchable tech giants, cratered 5.2%. It was a financial horror movie, and the popcorn, well, it wasn't free. Within hours, investors discovered a cruel twist. Those beautiful global supply chains they loved had become hostage situations from the United States government. Industrial titans like Boeing and Caterpillar got pummeled, down nearly 7%, while Detroit automakers watched their stock prices get shredded by 5 to 8%. Even the invincible tech overlords weren't safe. Apple stock plunged over 8%, obliterating billions of dollars in seconds. Amazon and Nvidia lost around 7%. Why? Because suddenly, having your entire business depend on assembling overpriced electronics in a country you're economically attacking seemed a bit, short-sighted. Who would have thought? Markets in Europe and Asia didn't just politely watch, they joined the crash party enthusiastically. Germany's DAX dropped 3%, France's CAC 40 down a similar amount, while Asia woke up to its own version of panic selling. Japan's Nikkei fell 2.8%, and Hong Kong's Hang Seng lost 3.5%, realizing that being deeply connected in global trade has a dark side. Currency markets erupted in chaos. Investors desperately fled risk, causing the US dollar to slump, while safe havens like the Japanese yen surged. Suddenly, emerging market currencies began sinking, with China's yuan hitting an 18-month low. Currency traders who generally love volatility briefly paused to question their career choices. Yet, as terrifying as this stock plunge has been over the last 24 to 48 hours, this is just the opening act. Beneath the market's bubbly surface lay decades of reckless borrowing, speculative mania, and complacency. April's tariff-triggered crash was just the needle needed to pop the global economy's giant bubble party, a bubble that was built on easy credit, wishful thinking, and a dash of good old-fashioned greed. In fact, over the last 5 years, some have been calling this the mother of all bubbles, where assets all around the world have become drastically inflated. For example, housing prices had reached absurd heights. Right now, around a ton of the United States, home affordability is at its worst ratio ever recorded. Before the April crash, US stocks were valued at over 200% of GDP, higher than during the dot-com mania, which was the highest or most overvalued stock market in the history of the United States. Historically, that number is at around 60 to 80%, and right now it is over 200%. Now, humanity has also borrowed a ton of money. By late 2024, global debt hit a nauseating $323 trillion, which is 328% of global GDP. Governments, companies, and individuals all decided financial caution was, well, that was for suckers, borrowing with gleeful abandon while interest rates stayed low. But with rates now rising, servicing this debt became a nightmare, especially for countries like the US, whose national debt exceeds 120% of GDP. There's also corporate debt, because companies worldwide binge borrowed, buoyed by low interest rates and investor recklessness. Now, with profits tanking, debt-laden corporations face potential bankruptcy. In fact, right now there are more zombie companies that are barely clinging to life right now, that can only really pay off their debt by taking on debt. There are more of those companies than at any other time in the history of the United States. Now, all of those things point to something called the everything bubble, or the mother of all bubbles. And now, potentially with these global tariffs from the United States, that might be the pin that caused the everything bubble to burst. And here's the thing, virtually no one is prepared. Governments have no fiscal room left to maneuver. They're stuck between a rock, which is high debt, and a hard place, which is political gridlock. Stimulus checks and bailouts, they're kind of off the table right now. Citizens already are angry about inflation and debt accumulation, and so it would be really tough to cause more of that. Central banks are similarly trapped. Interest rates remained elevated due to stubborn inflation, so cutting rates aggressively would risk spiraling prices and potential currency collapses. The Federal Reserve, the ECB, and the Bank of Japan collectively sighed, and have sort of agreed that they are almost out of monetary magic tricks to do if things go bad. Households and businesses, well, they are also in a bleak scenario. Savings rates have plummeted. Many Americans lack even $1,000 in emergency funds right now. Businesses, especially small ones, have thin cash reserves and mountains of debt. Layoffs are also piling up right now, with every industry suddenly facing downsizing. Banks and large private equity funds, and even Warren Buffett himself, well, they're recalculating their risks and either cashing out or buying things like gold or bonds. So right now, some people are pointing towards that we are about to enter a recession that we have not seen in a very long time. GDP forecasts are plunging by the hour. Consumer confidence is collapsing faster than, well, crypto scams. Politicians are squabbling at each other, and central banks are worried. And so if this were to continue, there are two poor possible outcomes. One is we enter something like a very deep recession or depression lasting a few years. Unemployment spikes, people lose their homes, their jobs, their life savings, and things start to get really bad. Or the government decides to, well, do things like keep printing money and taking on more debt, which will further hurt the middle class. It will keep inflating assets, make the cost of living go up, and just push the problem down the line a little bit further. Also, because the USA seems to be making less allies recently, there's a good chance that geopolitical conflicts will potentially escalate in some scenarios, and it could be something like China and Taiwan. Now, those geopolitical risks probably will not come into effect in the next year or so, but as we've seen throughout history, tariffs on this scale across the entire world tend to have domino effects, sometimes decades down the line. But what do you think will happen? Let me know in the comments down below. Do you think that we are heading into a financial abyss, or do you think that this is just a blip on the radar? If you want to learn how to grow your YouTube channel, make sure to check out my YouTube Creator Academy in the link down below. And make sure to click on my documentaries playlist to see more videos just like this from me. So click on that and I'll see you guys in a few seconds.